Good evening. What if you found out one day that sunsets aren't real? That they're just all in your head? Everywhere was always light and the stars were never out, and nobody had ever heard of a sunset. All references to sunsets were gone because you had simply imagined them. Imagine, on the other hand, that you woke up one day and everyone had forgotten about farts. You described farts to other people and they had no idea what you were talking about. Why would you want something like that? They would say. The latter would be nice. One would feel disillusioned over the loss of sunset, but I don't think most people would feel disillusioned with the loss of smelly farts. Feeling disillusioned isn't the same as learning something isn't true. It's the feeling of losing an illusion that we wanted to be true. It's the sadness of learning that someone one liked has done things that are not so great. It's the letdown in finding out that the Phoenix Lights are flares, or that the Cottingley Fairies were a hoax. But with disillusionment, there also comes learning. Sir Isaac Newton looked to the light of the setting sun to understand his Christian God by studying light itself. In many ways, he was like a ufologist, trying to find a nuts and bolts explanation involving non-human intelligence. Quote, "From his true dominion it follows that the true God is a living, intelligent, and powerful being, and from his other perfections that he is supreme or most perfect. He is eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient. That is, his duration reaches from eternity to eternity, his presence from infinity to infinity. He governs all things and knows all things that are or can be done." Unquote. That's from Newton's Principia, a work attempting to lay a foundation for the study of the natural world using mathematics. Is there disillusionment in finding that the modern tradition of science was developed and innovated largely by Christian men attempting to understand the nature of their particular Christian God? Or does this knowledge teach us something about science and the people who do science? That really it doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter whether or not you just imagined it. In the end, the sunset is still so beautiful. The delays in the sulfur piece I promised are entirely because of procrastination due to writer's block, I'll tentatively say, and are not in any way deliberately. I do sincerely apologize. I shouldn't have promised a piece in the first place. Generally speaking, making promises on the internet is probably just a bad idea for me. However, I've been reading a lot about sulfur and examining the various hot, sulfury smells produced by my body. And I do firmly want to believe that a piece about sulfur will be here soon. In fact, there will probably be a whole series of pieces on sulfur, just not today, and please don't take my word for it. Thank you for your patience. I'm still bad at this. Anyway, I have found even more toxic foam. And how do the beliefs of UFO researchers change over time with regards to pigs being able to fly? Plus, the UFOs that discovered Pluto also spotted a man named Clyde Tombaugh right here on Earth. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
I'm Jeff Knox.
Welcome to Ufo Sunset.
Welcome.
And now for the rebrief. There was a massive foam flood in Brunswick, Maine. On August 19th, the Brunswick Fire Department reported to the Maine Department of Environmental Protection that more than 50,000 gallons of aqueous firefight foam, or AFFF, was released from Hangar 4 of the Brunswick Executive Airport due to a malfunctioning fire suppression system. On Thursday, tests on local water found 3.2 billion parts per trillion of perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, or PFOS, which is an extremely high concentration. PFOS is called a forever chemical, meaning that it belongs to a type of human-made chemicals called polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. Other forever chemicals were also present in the firefight foam concentration. Excuse me. While these forever chemicals can be toxic to humans, they also spread through the environment very easily and do not easily break down. At a Thursday town hall meeting, locals complained of their well water potentially being contaminated, while testing of well water is prohibitively expensive and impractical. Steve Walker, the director of the Brunswick Topsham Land Trust, expressed concerns over airborne foam that landed in a local community garden used by immigrants and asylum seekers. On Friday, firefighters also used 47 gallons of firefight foam to extinguish a tractor-trailer fire in South Portland, which contaminated a small suburban gravel wetland. This story follows up on previous stories we reported on 2 weeks ago involving foam pollutants, including another flood of fire suppression foam at a U.S. Coast Guard hangar in Mobile, Alabama. And yet another solar storm reached middle latitudes. On Tuesday night, a coronal mass ejection, or CME, struck Earth, and another substorm, or a solar storm that extends to latitudes below the Arctic, extended at least as far south as Virginia, according to Daisy Dobrjevic, reporting for Space.com. The storm was initially weak, but then strengthened to a moderate or G2 storm when magnetic fields in the wake of the CME connected with the Earth's electromagnetic field, according to spaceweather.com. According to one aurora watcher in the Czech Republic, Petr Horalik, auroras like the one on Tuesday night have not been witnessed in Central Europe since 2001. This follows multiple other substorms and numerous powerful solar flares this year and late last year, which we've also reported on in various previous episodes. This solar activity continues to confirm the increased activity of solar cycle 25 that was predicted by NOAA. The peak of this cycle may currently be underway, and increased activity is expected to continue through 2025. Solar weather reporter Dr. Tamitha Skov, Solar weather reporter Dr. Tamitha Skov reported that the solar storms from last week appear to be calming down, with solar winds continuing for the next few days. It is possible that we'll see more auroras tonight and tomorrow night, but those should be calming down. She does forecast a high chance of solar flares this week, though, potentially through the week with a chance of X-class or high-intensity flares. This could mean minor radio blackouts. Please be sure to check out Dr. Skov's content for much more in-depth solar weather forecasts. Earth has an electrostatic field that shoots plasma into space. A new study published in Nature on Thursday reveals the first detection of a long-theorized energy field around the Earth. The study team at NASA, led by Glenn A. Collinson, utilized the NASA Endurance rocket, which was launched from Svalbard, Norway in May of 2022. The rocket measured the change in voltage of the atmosphere while at an altitude of about 480 miles. Newsweek science reporter Jess Thompson quoted study co-author Susie Imber as saying, quote, "Svalbard is the only rocket range in the world where you can fly through the polar wind and make the measurements we needed." Unquote. The polar wind is a stream of ionized hydrogen from the Earth's atmosphere at the poles. The ambipolar field is an electrostatic field that has long been hypothesized to explain this outflow of hydrogen ions. The field is also used to explain how regions of negatively charged plasma are able to form equilibrium with negatively charged regions full of electrons in the upper atmosphere. In theory, they do this by using the ambipolar field, a field of electricity that basically keeps a field of electrical charge that basically keeps different charges in the atmosphere stable. However, this field also has the ability to move gases and particles, extending the height of Earth's atmosphere by 271%, according to the new study. The field also has the ability to shoot hydrogen ions into space at the Earth's geomagnetic poles, and it does this at speeds so great that the ions are flung entirely out of Earth's gravity well. This stream of supersonic ions into deep space is called the polar wind. While the polar wind is well documented, this is the first time that the ambipolar field has been detected. This effectively confirms a third fundamental field produced by Earth, which will have general implications for how plasma interacts and moves about in the atmospheres of planets like Earth. And now for Mr. Jeff Knox.
Hello, hello. First of all, I want to apologize if my StreamYard seemed to be lagging a little bit earlier, so if I'm cutting out, somebody let me know. Today, we are going to be talking about the Clyde Tombaugh sighting. But first, this sighting took place in Las Cruces, New Mexico on August 20th, 1949. But first, a little introduction to Clyde Tombaugh if people are not familiar with him. Clyde Tombaugh, in early 1930, Clyde Tombaugh, a self-taught astronomer from a poor family in rural Kansas, discovered Pluto, making a significant moment for both scientific community and the public. Clyde Tombaugh was born in 1906, and he was born to a kind of this poor rural family. And when he was about 16, I believe or so, they moved to Bernadette, Kansas, and his parents were both kind of farmers. He developed an interest in astronomy as a teenager and started to build his own telescopes. In fact, he had seen, when he was 20 years old in 1926, he had kind of built this first telescope of his. He had seen an article in Popular Astronomy the year before on how to build a telescope. And so he built this telescope at his home. And he started to take drawings of Mars and Jupiter. And in 1928, after sending some of these drawings to Vesta M. Slifer, the director of Lowell Observatory, kind of originally just looking to get like some opinions and some advice, they actually ended up offering him a job. And they hired him to search for Planet X, which is a theoretical planet beyond Neptune that had been predicted by Percival Lowell. And so at this point, he's basically uneducated. He's just a self-trained astronomer. He doesn't have any schooling. And he goes to work for Lowell Observatory because he didn't have any money. The family didn't have any money to send him away to school. In fact, he had to drop out of high school to help his family with their farm because they didn't have money to hire people. And in January 1929, Clyde Tombaugh would begin his search for Planet X at the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. He would take numerous photographic plates of the night sky on this 13-inch astrograph you can kind of see him sitting next to. And they would take pictures of the night sky, capturing the same region, but several days apart. And then they would use a blink comparator, which essentially took these two images, and through blinking, it helped your brain to be able to perceive differences in the two images. So you could notice that like there was a speck there that wasn't in the other image. And so using this blink comparator, Tombaugh compared pairs of these images to detect whether there were any moving objects, as the stationary stars would appear in the same spot every single night, whereas the planet would seem to shift position by a little bit between a couple-day exposure. So despite this various kind of tedious and cold work in this kind of unheated kind of outdoors kind of room, kind of telescope room that he did this work in, he continued diligently on this work. And on February 18th, 1930, while scanning a set of plates he had taken a few weeks earlier, he identified a moving object which, based on its movement, was located at the predicted distance beyond Neptune and was likely the sought-after planet they were looking for. And we can see here that he's comparing an image of January 23rd, 1930 to January 28th, 6 days later. And you can kind of see this object that wasn't in the January 23rd, or that had moved since the January 23rd image. This discovery was then announced on March 13th, 1930, which coincided with the anniversary of both Herschel's discovery of Uranus and Percival Lowell's birthday. The name Pluto was suggested by an 11-year-old girl in England and was chosen partly in honor of Lowell's name, whose initials PL are the first two initials of Pluto, but it's also named after the Greek god of the underworld. Pluto was an earlier name for Hades. And when they discovered one of its moons, they would later name it Charon, which trafficked the bodies, the souls, in the afterlife. Now, although initially celebrated as the ninth planet, Pluto's status was later challenged as astronomers discovered other similar-sized objects. In fact, in 2003, I believe they found an object in the Kuiper Belt that is roughly the size of Pluto. And there's several more objects they have found that are almost as large as Pluto. So in 2006, the International Astronomical Unit redefined the criteria for planet status, leading Pluto to be reclassified as a dwarf planet. Tombaugh would continue his career in astronomy and took an interest in UFOs. He passed away in 1997 before Pluto's reclassification. It is his interest in UFOs, and specifically his famous UFO sighting, that, however, brings our attention to Tombaugh today. And his UFO sighting first came to the public's attention in the famous article in Life magazine, Having Visitors from Space, in April 1952. But they do get some of the kind of the details wrong here. The things I kind of like highlighted in red in this original article are wrong and not actually accurate details. But on the night of August 20th, 1949, while stargazing from his home in Las Cruces, New Mexico, Tombaugh, along with his wife and mother-in-law, observed an unusual event. They saw a formation of faint blue-green rectangles moving across the sky. Tombaugh described the sighting as strange and unprecedented in his extensive experience in night sky observations. I think it's important to see what Tombaugh says directly himself. And in fact, he would reiterate that people directly quote this. And this is a statement he put out in 1957 with all the kind of relevant details for his case. He would get so many inquiries about this that he just kind of would give this out as like a form response because he was tired of responding to all of them. So according to Tombaugh, in his document here, an unusual aerial phenomenon by Clyde W. Tombaugh. I saw the object about 11 o'clock one night in August 1949 from the backyard of my home in Las Cruces, New Mexico. It happened to be looking at zenith, admiring the beautiful transparent sky of stars, when suddenly I spied a geometrical group of faint bluish-green rectangles of light similar to the Lubbock lights. My wife and her mother were sitting in the yard with me, and they saw them also. The group moved southeasterly. The individual rectangles became foreshortened, the space of formation smaller, at first about 1 degree across, and the intensity duller, fading from view once they reached about 45 degrees above the horizon. Total time of visibility was about 3 seconds. I was too flabbergasted to count the number of rectangles of light, or to note some of the other features I would wonder about later. There was no sound. I have done thousands of hours of night sky watching, but never saw a light so strange to me as this. The rectangles of light were of low luminosity. Had there been a full moon in the sky, I am sure they would not have been visible. And I'm just going to throw up here the audio might not be the greatest. I hope you guys can hear it. It's an undated recording of Clyde Tombaugh. It's about a minute long, just kind of briefly reciting his encounter here.
Well, of the three different types of objects that I have seen, I would say the most extraordinary one was one I saw in 1949 in August in Las Cruces from my backyard. On that particular evening, my wife and her mother and I were enjoying the cool air, and I was admiring the beautiful transparent sky with the stars, and I happened to be looking overhead, and suddenly I spied a strange group of lights moving, and I said, look, and they saw it immediately, and then I would say they were visible for about 3 seconds of time, and they disappeared at a height of about 35 degrees above the southeastern horizon. No sound, and they seemed to kind of pale out. The rectangles of feeble light seemed to foreshorten into slits. And I've never seen anything like it before or since, and I'm very much puzzled as to what the thing was.
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry. I was muted there for a second. So yeah, I apologize. The audio on that was a little quiet. I don't know how well people could hear it, but I do link to it in my thread, and you can go try and listen to it there. But Tombaugh would provide some additional details in a letter to Richard Hall of NICAP in September 1957. This letter was published in the UFO evidence that NICAP put out. And in it, he states that, regarding the solidity of the phenomenon I saw, my wife thought she saw a faint connecting glow across the structure. The illuminated rectangles I saw did maintain an exact fixed position with respect to each other, which would tend to support the impression of solidity. I doubt the phenomenon was any terrestrial reflection, because some similarity to it should have been apparent many times. I do a great deal of observing, both telescopic and unaided eye, in the backyard, and nothing of its kind has ever appeared before or since. And I think it's important to note that also the differences here kind of between what Clyde Tombaugh and his wife Patty saw. As we can see here, this bottom sketch by Tombaugh is something that he included on an Air Force questionnaire that he would eventually turn in January 1953. And it's pretty similar to a sketch he had drawn for a French investigator as well, where you see these kind of rectangles. We don't know exactly how many he saw. He didn't take the time to count, or didn't think to count, but he saw them in this basic geometric shape. But his wife, however, who apparently only saw the sighting for the last 1.5 seconds or so, saw it a bit differently. She saw that kind of a connecting glow across the structure. She described it as almost scimitar shaped, this kind of curved scimitar shaped, and she drew it as you see in this kind of above drawing here. Now, Tombaugh kind of explains the potential differences between what his wife sees and what he saw with basically the acuity of the vision. He says that his wife's vision is not quite as good as his, and that would explain why her sighting is slightly different than his. She didn't really see those like windows in a geometric shape. She saw, some kind of points of light and kind of a scimitar kind of shape there. But she believed there was a structure, whereas he could not really see any sort of a structure from the object. It would just tend to imply a structure because these lights seem to maintain their geometric position in relation to each other. Now, Donald H. Menzel, a UFO skeptic, addressed this case in two of his books. He first addressed it in his 1953 book, Flying Saucers, and again in his 1963 book, The World of Flying Saucers. And in it, he expresses a pretty much the same kind of theory. He just kind of tries to, I guess, elaborate a bit more on it in The World of Flying Saucers 10 years later, in which he proposes that the lights were, he has us to guess that a low, thin layer of haze or smoke reflected the lights of a distant house or some other multiple points on a source of light. Now, James McDonald, who was the actual atmospheric physicist, refuted Menzel's theory, calling it physically absurd. And in this letter he wrote to Richard Hall at NICAP in 1966, he additionally states, no inversion ever known in the history of meteorology would give reflection at the near normal incidence involved here. So what that means is near normal incidence and the zenith, that's at the high point. So there's never been kind of this a haze or an inversion that would create a kind of this mirage reflection effect directly above a person. And they apparently have never witnessed that. I'm not a meteorologist. I can't actually speak to that, but I'll take his word on that. And I do know there are skeptics too that don't buy this kind of temperature inversion kind of theory that Menzel kind of suggests here. And Tombaugh would later admit to ufologist Leonard H. Stringfield that he had seen other objects, including green fireballs. In fact, he said, I have seen 3 objects within the past 7 years which defied any explanation of no known phenomenon, such as Venus, atmospheric optics, meteors, or planes. I am a professional, highly skilled observer, astronomer. In addition, I have seen 3 green fireballs, which are unusual in behavior from scores of normal green fireballs. So I find it interesting here that he acknowledges that green fireballs are actually fairly normal and common. It's just that he also believes he had seen 3 of them that were somehow unusual or different than normal green fireballs, which he has seen kind of in the past. And it's important to keep in mind that when this was happening in 1949, 1948, this is during the green fireball period when La Paz and Project Twinkle and whatnot were investigating the green fireballs in the area. And in the same letter, he also would state that despite his professional skepticism, though, he does acknowledge the possibility of extraterrestrial origins for some of these phenomenon, and that he thinks it's basically unprofessional that some people aren't willing to accept that as a potential possibility, at least. And this is kind of something he would reiterate elsewhere in other letters later on. And the following year, in January 1957, Tombaugh would suggest that interstellar life could exist elsewhere in the galaxy. And he would state in this article, Celestial Visitors, from the Alamogordo News in January 1957, although our own solar system is believed to support no other life on Earth, other stars in the galaxy may have hundreds of thousands of inhabitable worlds. But he would later express some reservations about these ideas and whether or not they could explain kind of UFO sightings. And in fact, by the early 1960s, Tombaugh would appear to kind of lean towards this natural explanation, similar towards Menzel's atmospheric reflection theory. So what had happened was over the pretty much from 1952 through the 1961, Menzel had correspondence back and forth with Tombaugh, where he essentially tried to convince him of his reflection theory and that it was this kind of reflection off of a haze. And each time Menzel would kind of rebuff him and state that he didn't think the reflection theory worked because there seemed to be something more solid there. Basically what we've seen him share in other letters to people about how he thought there was some solidity here. And so he rebuffed Menzel, multiple times over these letters. until finally, in December 1961, Menzel would write this letter to him, I guess trying a different tactic to try and kind of, because this is a couple of years before he's about to publish his new book, and he's trying to kind of get a quote from Tombaugh and kind of wrap up this case. And apparently he had been earlier in the year in September, had been in the car with Tombaugh driving, and they had actually discussed this case. And so he writes this letter later in the year in December to Tombaugh, and he says, "You told me, if I recall correctly, you had independently come to essentially the same conclusion that I had, that a thin temperature inversion existed of a relatively low elevation, that smoke, haze, or dust was collecting in a thin layer, very thin, at a relatively low altitude, that some unknown cause in the vicinity of an airfield there could be many caused a ripple in this thin haze layer, that as a result of this tipping, it reflected the light of the nearby houses, and the progressive wave produced the motion." So I guess, I wasn't in the car with him. I don't know what Menzel actually told him in the car, but Menzel, what Tombaugh told Menzel, but Menzel suggests that he agreed with him, says, "Hey, you told me this. This agrees with what I say. What do you say? Can we get a quote?" And he replies with this handwritten letter in January 1962, where, and this is where Menzel gets the quote that he then prints in his later book in 1963, The World About Flying Saucers, that seems to kind of reverse the entire opinion that Tombaugh had given to date. And this letter is kind of hard to read, but we do get the direct quotes from it that Menzel put in his book, where Tombaugh states, quote, "A much more likely source of explanation is some natural optical phenomenon in our own atmosphere. In my 1949 sighting, the faintness of the object, together with the manner of fading in intensity as it traveled away from zenith towards the southeastern horizon, is quite suggestive of a reflection from an optical boundary or surface of slight contrast in reflective index, as in an inversion layer." So again, this is kind of the opposite, where he told people we didn't think it could be a reflection. He goes on to say, "I have never seen anything like it before or since, and I have spent a lot of time where the night sky could be seen well. This suggests that the phenomenon involves a comparatively rare set of conditions or circumstances to produce it, but nothing like the odds of interstellar visitation." So again, this is kind of an exact, like a 180 from before, where he implied because he's seen the sky so much, and that because he would have noticed something like this if it happened, that implies it's not a natural phenomenon. Here he says that's actually exactly why it implies it's a natural phenomenon, and that it was actually just a rare set of circumstances. He would go on to state back about his opinions about intelligent life, kind of reversing what he had said. Quote, "From my own studies of the solar system, I cannot entertain any serious possibility for intelligent life on the other planets. Not even for Mars, the planet for which I've devoted considerable observation and study for the past 35 years. The logistics of visitations from planets revolving around the nearest star is staggering. In consideration of the hundreds of millions of years in the geological timescale when such visitations may possibly have occurred, the odds of a single visit in a given century or millennium are overwhelmingly against such an event." And keep in mind, at this time, a lot of people were still kind of thinking about life in the universe potentially, particularly in 1949. This is 1961 when he wrote this letter, but back then other planets were still kind of one of the leading kind of theories for flying saucers, for otherworldly origins for flying saucers. Now, however, despite what he told Menzel just in 1961, 5 years later, James McDonald, atmospheric physicist, had called Tombaugh to talk to him on the phone about his sighting and explained to him, that this reflection theory was physically absurd. It doesn't work. And Tombaugh seems to agree with him that it's not a reflection, despite what he told Menzel just 5 years earlier, or 4 years earlier. And he would reiterate to McDonald that he believed that UFOs warranted a scientific investigation and that extraterrestrial visitation does remain a possibility and should be considered. So again, he kind of flipped back there again with McDonald. Now, By 1975, though, he would concede that the sighting remained an open question. And this might be the last time he kind of talks about his UFO sighting in a 1975 article published in Science Digest that was written, titled "The Man Who Discovered Planet X." And it's kind of at the very end of the article, they addressed his the UFO question and his UFO sighting. And it states, "There's one subject that Tombaugh likes to avoid, UFOs. In 1949, on a moonless night in Las Cruces, Tombaugh was relaxing in his backyard. Then he saw a formation of greenish-blue rectangular lights crossing the sky in an astonishing time of 3 seconds. I was working at White Sands then and knew we didn't have anything that could do that. So I reported it to the FBI and asked them not to make my report public," he recalled. "But it leaked out, and I've gotten thousands of crank letters since. I've been accused of having hallucinations. I don't have hallucinations. I've actually seen 2 other strange phenomena since, but I didn't bother to report them. But I don't want any more to do with it. It has become ridiculous. As far as what he might have seen, Tombaugh is still puzzled. He states, "It is still a very open question," he has admitted, "but I can't have my career or reputation damaged by any more association with the UFO question." And this is kind of an opinion that he would reiterate, multiple times, that while he felt UFOs are worthy of study, it also wasn't something that scientists got into because of the kind of crazy or unreliable kind of individuals. And one of these, he actually, the Lorenzens who founded the APRO organization stayed at Tombaugh's house back in 1957. And he would reiterate again to them that he felt the subject warrants sincere scientific investigation, but feels compelled to steer clear of the situation himself, since previous commitments prevented him from doing a thorough job. So almost 20 years apart, he believes the study should be topicked, but that there's consequences for doing it and that it interferes with his serious work. But at the same point, he still felt important to talk about his sighting because he stated that because of his status and his position, he had an obligation to tell people about his sighting and that they present the details as accurately as possible, and that the topic be studied, even if he may have been skeptical and saw the negative effects of being directly involved himself. In fact, he had some interesting things to say about Donald Kehoe. First, I'm just going to play you this 1 minute clip, 50-second clip or so from from the Armstrong Circle Theater, where he briefly mentions the Clyde Tombaugh case. But keep in mind, he gets the details kind of completely wrong here. Nobody described it as a cigar, and some of the various other details he describes it as.
Astronomer Dr. Clyde Tombaugh, discoverer of the planet Pluto. Dr. Tombaugh sighted a cigar-shaped object with what appeared to be windows and moving at tremendous speed. Now note how similar this object is to the one sighted by Captain Childs and Whitted that you mentioned earlier. Dr. Tombaugh, these things, which do appear to be directed, are unlike any other phenomena I ever observed. Other stars in our galaxy may have hundreds of thousands of inhabitable worlds. Races on these worlds may have been able to utilize the tremendous amounts of power required to bridge the space between the stars." End quote. Let me show you one more case.
So, Kehoe, Tombaugh had a bit of an issue with Kehoe, not actually because of how he described the sighting there, but because of his kind of general shoddy work that Kehoe did, and how he kind of would take all sorts of details and confabulate them together and get things kind of wrong. And he had an issue specifically with Donald Kehoe's Flying Saucer Conspiracy book. And to provide a little bit of background on what his issue here is, when Clyde Tombaugh was in the early 1950s, he had suggested a project to the Army Ordnance Division where they would look for natural satellites. They were basically looking for small objects like asteroids or other small rocks that got captured into Earth's orbit that might be orbiting up there, because in the buildup of the space race, there were concerns about potential hazards of when we shoot rockets and things up there, are we going to hit some of these objects? And so they had sponsored this search for these satellites to look to see if there was any of these objects that had got captured in our orbit. Well, because of the kind of closed-lip nature of this, and people weren't really talking about this, the media started to put out a lot of these kind of conspiracy theories about the project, that they were looking for artificial extraterrestrial satellites. In fact, some of these newspaper articles are still used today as proof for the Black Knight conspiracy theory, when those articles were actually little more than exaggerated fluff, based on a kernel of truth, but they weren't actually looking for extraterrestrial artificial satellites. It was just a survey of the night sky to look for any potential natural orbiting satellites, like natural rocks, not spaceships, that got captured in orbit. Upon completion of the study, they didn't actually find any. But Kehoe would kind of run with this conspiracy theory and essentially accuse Tombaugh of cover-up, of being involved in a look for extraterrestrial objects and covering it up and hiding it, in his book. And he wasn't very pleased about this. And he wrote to Tombaugh in a letter. He wrote to Stringfield, in this letter in March 24th, 1956. I am very disappointed in Major Kehoe's recent book, The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. If the rest of the book is as exaggerated and suggestive of erroneous and fantastic meaning as the part he has about my satellite search work, then it is worthless. His logic is certainly very poor. Such treatment does vast harm by driving away any scientific analysis by those who are competent and honest to do so. No wonder many scientists shun getting involved in the flying saucer phenomenon. And I've got to agree with them here. It's the thing that pushes scientists away. It's not, the government and stigma and debunkers. It's the irrational, more sensational, fantastic side of the topic that pushes scientists away from wanting to be involved in it. And so while he, again, felt it was important to study, he felt that scientists, were pushed away from it because of people like Kehoe and others that, stigmatize the topic with sensationally unfounded stories. And you might say that Tombaugh's first sighting was actually in 1941, but it's not really a UFO sighting. It was something he saw on Mars. In 1949, Tombaugh informed Commander Robert McLaughlin, the Naval Missile Director at White Sands Missile Range, who people might be familiar with for his own famous sighting that he would write an article in True magazine about. And he had told him that he observed this bright flash on Mars in August 1941, which he believed was due to an atomic explosion. As he notes in this letter between McLaughlin to James Van Allen, which people might know from the Van Allen belts. And Tombaugh would also remark that the Earth's first atomic bomb test in New Mexico would have illuminated the dark side of Earth like a neon sign. And since Mars was relatively close at this time, he implied that the atomic test might have been visible from Mars. Now, I find this really interesting, actually, because one of the reasons why people talk about the connection between UFOs and nuclear sites, or the suggestion that it was actually us setting off atomic bombs that brought the saucers, as many people have suggested, is that people talk about is because somehow a nuclear bomb kind of releases a signal that they can pick up or detect elsewhere. Well, the original origin of this kind of theory, though, was because people still believed Mars was inhabited. And so they believed because if we could see explosions on Mars, which we have, there's many of newspaper articles of astronomers reporting seeing explosions on Mars, that they thought, logically, then someone on Mars could see an explosion here. Well, now we know Mars is not inhabited. So they could not have seen our nuclear explosions, but yet this sort of idea that the UFOs were attracted to these nukes has persisted, despite, we now knowing that nobody's on Mars to have actually visually witnessed this. So the story's kind of changed now that nukes somehow release some sort of other detectable signature that could be detected far away in space. And it still attracted the aliens. It's just not Mars anymore. But it was actually Tombaugh here back in 1949 suggesting potential aliens on Mars could have seen our explosions, and that's what brought our saucers to us. But his other most relevant and important kind of UFO sighting here to end off with he had, and it's very similar. In June 1952, Dr. J.L.N. Hynek, who is an astronomer serving as a scientific consultant on the Air Force's Project Blue Book UFO study, discreetly surveyed fellow astronomers on UFO sightings and their views during an astronomy convention. Tombaugh, along with 4 other astronomers, including Lincoln LaPaz, shared details of their own UFO sightings with Hynek. He would tell Hynek about a second sighting of a bright moving object rapidly across the sky, similar to the previous phenomenon he had observed in August 1949, and that was reported in Life magazine. He states that, quote, while at telescope number 3 at White Sands, he observed an object of -6 magnitude, 4 times brighter than the planet Venus at its brightest, traveling from the zenith to the southern horizon in about 3 seconds. The object executed the same maneuvers as the nighttime luminous object which was reported in Life magazine. No sound was associated with either sighting. And Hynek would publish this in his report on that survey he did, which is really at the time a classified memo that people didn't see. He would reiterate and kind of give some more details about his sighting in a March 1961 letter to Menzel. But we can see the sighting is almost identical. It happened at the zenith. It traveled in the same direction in the exact same time period as his previous sighting. It just seemed to happen a little later. He's unclear on the exact date. He tried to look at his file. He told Menzel later he tried to look at his files to figure out the exact date this second sighting happened, but he was unable to determine that. So he did have 2 sightings that are fairly similar, fairly identical. One while doing his military work, and one while he was at home in his backyard with his wife and mother-in-law. So as to what he actually saw, like I say, we have a couple of, we have a few different theories to go with. There's the Menzel theory of the reflection. And personally, I don't think that actually works, like I say, but I'm not a meteorologist. But from what I've seen, nobody's reported kind of mirage, kind of like reflection effects in similar conditions. Another theory that's been proffered up is that, and if you recall, it's been compared to the Lubbock Lights events, which may be controversial, but may in fact just have been plovers. In fact, one of the first sightings that kind of kicked off the Lubbock Light events was plovers. The guy who saw it identified them as plovers and said it was identical to the Lubbock Lights. So one of the theories is that it was birds and that it was a reflection of the birds that he was seeing. Another theory, I think, is it's been compared to the Child's Whitted sighting as well. And we now know that sighting was just a fireball going through the sky at the time. And the witnesses were experiencing what we know as the airship effect, where what we perceive to be windows, moving in the sky that is actually just like a meteor breaking up and bright points of light. I think that's possibly the most likely explanation, particularly given the short duration, is that they were just seeing a bluish green meteor. Now, the argument people will make is that he was a professional observing astronomer, right, with many thousands of hours experience watching the night sky. So you would think he would be able to identify a green meteor or meteorite if that's what it was. And the fact that he thought it was unusual might imply that it's not. And maybe that's true, but you also have to keep in mind that even professional trained observers get things wrong. Even professional astronomers misidentify things. And perhaps it is a combination of various weird atmospheric conditions and a meteor sighting that just made it seem a little bit more weird than usual. So we can't say for sure. Tombaugh is dead. All we have is these letters we can go from. And I will say that even Menzel himself did not seem to be totally convinced and considered this case to be one of his most kind of confusing kind of cases that he could not nail down completely. But despite that, they both agree the spaceship explanation is still far more unlikely of a possibility. The odds are far greater than it just being a weird set of circumstances that made something prosaic seem unusual. So I think what he told Menzel is probably kind of I think there's a bit of him telling Menzel what he also wanted to hear, But I think he also kind of agreed that given that it's more likely that it's just a weird bunch of circumstances than it was something extraterrestrial. But it'll leave it up to you guys to decide what you think Tombaugh saw that night in August 1949. And that's it. Back to you guys.
Thanks, Jeff. And now I'm going to present some snippets from the UFO Handbook, a guide to investigating, evaluating, and reporting UFO sightings by Alan Hendry, a book written in 1979. But there was an edition in 1980. But this is just, this is actually from one of the last chapters in the book where he talks about not the eyewitnesses, the UFO investigators and the UFO groups, the civilian groups in the US at the time. And here he's talking about a kind of peculiar thing that's often seen among ufologists, which is that they start to adopt more and more high strangeness, like paranormal beliefs through their careers. They might start off as kind of hard-headed, nuts and bolts oriented people, but they end up being very much about the paranormal correlates of UFOs. And I'm interested to get your opinions, Rachel and Jeff, about whether you think this applies to Jacques Vallée, but I think it's a pretty clear trajectory when it comes to him that we see this sort of thing going on. So here Hendry starts off saying, borrowing a term from stellar evolution in astronomy, I've observed a sort of main sequence along which a great many ufologists seem to evolve in their attitudes. The motivating force is the struggle between the outcome that they desire, in other words, something like the ET hypothesis coming true, so proof of aliens, and frustration over what the evidence permits. So what does the evidence show? Obviously, it falls well short of demonstrating that extraterrestrials are visiting us or that otherworldly explanations are going on. So he goes into like 6 stages that he thinks that this is happening in. So let's go to the next one. Ufologist is willing to absorb all kinds of reports. So this is right at the beginning. Okay, so the ufologist is studying different things, like including high strangeness cases, but also the low strangeness cases, things like night lights, daylight discs, where there's not close contact with the UFOnauts, but it's just the craft or the supposed craft being seen. Even IFOs, the identified flying objects, although reliance on the UFO literature for input prohibits most of these. And his main concern, weeding out IFOs, interest in supportive evidence like radar and physical traces. Okay, so he wants to get rid of, the investigator wants to get rid of the identified flying objects like planes, other mundane events, and get to the supposed interesting stuff, and including the radar correlates of visual reports, and also physical trace cases where electromagnetic or other traces are left in the environment following a UFO encounter. His favorite theory is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, although he has got serious doubts about many of the more incredible sounding CE3 claims, like in other words, the very high strangeness cases where there are many elements of absurdity. And Vallée has, talked about this. In fact, Vallée has got a paper where he doubts the ETH based on precisely such claims by witnesses about the absurd medical procedures on board the spacecraft, etc. But he provides other reasons as well to doubt the ETH. But anyway, at the beginning of the investigation or the trajectory, the ufologist is basically following up many kinds of cases, and he's initially quite, or she is initially quite skeptical about the more incredible sounding close encounters of the third kind claims. Let's go to the next one, please. So then the ufologist is put off by the non-cohesive variety of the UFO reports. So there's a lot of different claims being made about the shape, duration, the color, etc. And it's doubtful that these all represent part of the same phenomenon, just as with IFOs, right? You got different phenomena going on. You can't just lump them together. So the night lights and daylight discs clearly are not leading anywhere in a hurry. So they become de-emphasized to almost IFO status. So they're not really deemed that interesting anymore because they're not really giving much information. He begins to concentrate on the high strangeness reports alone for their greater information yield, assuming as usual that all UFO reports conform to one single phenomenon. So he's basically starting to use the high strangeness reports as kind of a unifying principle or something that explains the UFO phenomenon in its totality and is giving more information than the less interesting NLs and DDs. Okay, and obviously you have to take, in this case, the witnesses at face value unless they are outright admitting that they're doing a hoax, which is pretty rare. But of course, as we know on this show, just because somebody does not admit a hoax doesn't mean that there wasn't one. And it doesn't mean that, on the other hand, it doesn't mean that they're not sincere if they do claim a CE3 of high strangeness, but it doesn't mean that they actually experienced a bona fide paranormal event. But in any case, in this second phase, you can see that the ufologist is sort of starting to lose interest in the NLs and DDs and is shifting a little bit more now to viewing the high strangeness reports as being more informative. Let's go to number 3. So ufologist realizes now that weeding out misperceptions from low strangeness sighting claims was much easier than isolating out more elusive close encounters, IFOs, fantasies, and hoaxes. He still attempts to discard CE3 stories that sound too absurd to be credible. At the same time, however, he's becoming discontented with the ETH due to the number of CE3s, their variety, the human aliens, like the Nordic type aliens, and which doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective, unless, of course, you support the idea that these aliens are our creators, which I'll get into later on when I talk about the Raelian movement. But the physical event, the psychic events and claims, etc. So all of these sorts of discrepancies and seeming absurdities are starting to militate against the ETH, right? And so the ufologist realizes that getting rid of the misperceptions cases is easy because you can check up on when an ad plane was in an area potentially, or if there was a meteor or something like that, or a star. Eliminate those cases as IFOs, but it's more difficult to get rid of these seemingly much stranger cases, the CE3 cases with a high strangeness content. Okay, and he's further getting more frustrated with the ETH's inability to account for these elements. Let's go to 4. So the lesser UFO reports have been totally ignored as noise, and the exotic, even absurd cases are piling up out of context. So they're gaining a much more prominent role in his or her thinking. The ufologist becomes impressed with this false weight of numbers, which he has artificially imposed. In other words, there's a sampling bias going on. It's not that there's more of these high strangeness cases than low strangeness cases. It's just that the ufologist is now becoming more interested in them and is receiving those at the expense of the less interesting low strangeness cases, okay? And so this is like a sampling bias effect. All of these people can't be wrong. We've heard that motif millions of times, that there's tons of people out there who have got these experiences or sightings. They can't all be wrong. So that, of course, ignores the deeper lessons of the UFO claims. You have to investigate like psychology, etc., the context. And confusion about which CE3s can be thrown out safely is growing with a ufologist. no longer certain what is relevant and what isn't. Okay, so he's starting to think, well, maybe this absurd stuff that I was initially throwing out is actually interesting, and that's where the real meat of the matter is. Should the CE3 data be judged at face value, or is something more insidious at work, is a universal concern at this phase. Let's go to 5. Yep. So increasing fascination with apparent psychic aspects of these absurd cases, ghost-like appearances, massless behavior, mental exchanges with witnesses, post-abduction psychic artifacts. Oh, sorry, after effects, not after artifacts. So after effects, like, and that is reminiscent of kind of the skinwalker stuff that we hear about today. What's it called? It's like some specific phrase that they've got, like when the poltergeists follow you around after a UFO sighting. So start of the concept that UFO witnesses' minds are being, manipulated in some paranormal fashion. Ufologist often thinks that this is his own original conclusion. Is often unaware that other ufologists have already looked at this claim and are promoting it as well. In fact, this theme has been around for a long time in ufology, especially with the contactees who are often claiming that they were in psychic contact with the ufonauts. And some of that came from being influenced by theosophy and things like that. But my point is that this was already present at the beginning of ufology, or near the beginning, but it wasn't necessarily credited by most ufologists at the time. So being open-minded at this stage means not abandoning the ETH altogether, or regarding some UFOs as physical concerns, the rest paranormal. So they're really starting to be open now to the possibility that the UFOs are not necessarily extraterrestrial, but that they could be something more paranormal. All CE2 cases are equally adopted and cataloged as data. So CE2 cases are where somebody sees a UFO and there's a physical trace in the environment, like electromagnetic effects on cars or radiation or something, physical imprints, etc. So those are, cataloged, with confessed hoaxes the sole exception. Disdainful ufologists who are still locked into the physical aspects of UFO appearances. There is no more emphasis on radar or physical traces. After all, can't poltergeists affect physical manifestations? So maybe something spiritual is going on. So why bother with looking for physical traces? Little distinction now between single or multiple witness status of reports, witness backgrounds, testimonial inconsistencies, etc. Only two things matter: sheer high strangeness, who'd make up a story like that, underwritten by the sheer sincerity of the witnesses. So in other words, it's no longer a case of like, is this person credible? It's more, are they being sincere? And just by the sheer high strangeness of the case, because supposedly people can't make up or conjure things like these by themselves. So they must be true. No story is too absurd sounding. If we go to the next one, is too absurd sounding to be discarded now, because the great number through abstracted collecting, that is the sampling bias of the ufologist, of absurd sounding claims indicates that the UFOs have chosen to deal intimately with us in this manner. So now this aspect is being taken as the main message of the UFO, that the UFOs are trying to communicate with us or project some meaning onto us. Statistics of different UFO reports are now based on indifferent mixtures of all types and merits of reports. So lumping everything together. So you can say that you've got a lot of cases, but how credible, how high quality are these cases, right? That's sort of thrown out the window in order to get the numbers up. Statistics is very fraught with danger in ufology, because if you just lump everything together, you're violating multiple conditions that make statistics worthy in the first place, but that's often ignored in ufology. Not all ufologists necessarily advance all the way along this main sequence. I think that Vallée definitely has. If you look at his early work, his early books from the 1950s and 60s, they were more hard-headed, nuts and bolts, more or less strictly scientific treatments of UFOs, where he's trying to at least, follow the scientific method, gather data, find patterns, etc. And later on, well, really culminating in his more recent work with, for example, Paula Harris, when they wrote the book about Trinity, that's really like out there, really kind of woo paranormal and psychic connections, etc. And so there's definitely been this sort of evolution in his thought. Some of them elect to anchor on one of the phases and stay there. So they don't necessarily move along the sequence. They can just stop at one of these phases and just basically adopt that as their position. Many of the nuts and bolts types hold fast to phase one, of course, and snub the paranormal alternatives. Consider this excerpt from an editorial written by the editor of a UFO newsletter in Australia. Even certain UFO research organizations are being duped into being converted to the new faith. Many of these groups publish literature that will do great honor to the John Keels, Vallée's, Lepoa, Trenks, and Hyneks, who are on the great phantasmagorical bandwagon of audacious postulants in the realm of UFOs. And by the way, this book was written in 1979. By then, Vallée had already started leaning heavily into the more paranormal aspects. It appears that individual, sorry, was that the right one? Go back, please. Could there be maybe there's a slide missing. Let me just have a quick look. Oh, sorry, no, that was just like the same line. It appears that individuals who were once regarded as staunch and sober-minded exponents of the ET hypothesis have suddenly become enamored with their own flights of fancy into the realms of fairy, the occult, or pseudopsychology and sociology. I think here is using the term sociology in a more esoteric sense, not the common notion of sociology. But yeah, so like this, these people sort of start off with the ET hypothesis, and then they evolve into this more fantastical realm of paranormal things. So has the ET hypothesis now become so traditional that one is considered sober-minded to blindly accept it? I did offer my own precautions about the use of the paranormal as a UFO explanation scheme in the UFO message chapter. Some researchers who are interested in the paranormal pride themselves that they have developed the controls necessary to discern whether a claimant is telling the truth about having, say, genuine psychic powers. If these people are such careful observers, could they explain how a clever magician performs his close-up tricks by watching him? If close-up tricks, so if they can't, what would it mean when said magician falsely portrays himself to have true psychic abilities? Sociologist Marcello Truzzi acknowledges that he can be fooled by a stage magician and thus maintains the compensatory skepticism necessary for open-mindedness. The greatest danger, he notes, lies with the people who are sure that they can't be deceived. They assume that they're good judges of character, that they are, intelligent, and they can discern when somebody's lying to them, but clearly often they can't. If we assume that observations offered about exotic UFO encounters provoke paranormal events have actually taken place, we have opted to overlook the desire to read these effects into misunderstood sightings clearly indicated by the IFO cases. So I think that was it, right, for that part. So I was actually reminded of this when I was reading this book by Diana Walsh Pasulka, who was a religious scholar. This book, Encounters, which is the kind of the sequel to her other book, American Cosmic, where she's kind of postulating this more paranormal framework for understanding UFOs. And let me just quote somebody she interviews. She calls him Gray Man. She doesn't give his name, but Gray Man 2 is the chapter. This is on page 86. Quoting Gray Man, upon returning to Earth, these are astronauts, the UFOnauts, oh, sorry, not the UFOnauts, the NASA astronauts from the Apollo missions, became the equivalent of an alien race visiting planet Earth. Did their families or colleagues start experiencing paranormal activity in their homes after meeting with the astronauts? Somehow I think not. Then why is it that virtually all of the UFO alien contact experiences that I'm aware of contain some type of paranormal phenomena that goes along with it? Well, that's a big claim right there. And again, it depends how you're collating your data, like what reports are you receiving. And, you know, with Pasulka herself, she kind of makes claims similar to that, or to the effect of that most UFO cases are actually of the high strangeness variety. And that, you know, this is like to do with a sampling effect. It's difficult enough to know like what proportion of different types of UFO cases there are relative to each other. But you've also got the reporting effect that you might be receiving a biased sample depending on how you're promoting yourself as well. So if you're, you know, saying that you're interested in these high strangeness cases, those are the ones that you're going to tend to receive more often. And then you can say in your database, most of them are high strangeness, but that's just because of a sampling effect. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. So yeah, but I mean, I think Valet definitely has gone through this trajectory. John Keel as well. I don't know how kind of nuts and bolts he was at the beginning, but I think he was. And I think Lou Elizondo as well is going through this right now. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say about that little excerpt from the UFO Handbook by Alan Hendry.
And now it is time for Ufos Book Club.
Cool.
Which is
the 1981 like the hardback version?
No, I think it's 1979 and 1980.
Because this is 1979, but
Yeah.
there's apparently a hardback version of it.
Yeah, that's what I said last time, but I was looking on eBay. I couldn't find any this time. But
Yeah. It's a good book, though.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Yeah, everyone. And I think there's a copy on Internet Archive, maybe, I think, these days.
there is.
Yeah. So anybody can go look at it.
Did we want to start with the Ufos Book Club?
Did you steal that, Jeff?
Yes, because they put Area 51 and all their signs up there.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
It's trademarked.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, book club. We're looking at the Raelian movement. I don't know how to say this person's name. Claude Morge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Mojang.
So this person is looking at the Raelian, or the claims of Claude Varilhon Réal. So Claude Varilhon is a French, basically sect or cult leader of this UFO religion. It's kind of a strange religion. It's kind of a type of atheistic creationism. He posits that the Elohim, the aliens, are actually physical flesh and blood organisms, but they created us like something like 25,000 years ago. And yes, they are lunatic hedonists, at least Rael is. And he's still doing his thing today in Japan. He was effectively booted out of several countries. In France, they just got sick of him. The sect felt like it was being persecuted, and then they moved to what was it, Quebec in Canada, and then to America, and then they got into that whole cloning debacle, and then I forget it was America first or Canada, but then eventually now he's in Japan and he's sort of set up another group. And there's apparently another group in or a sect in Africa, in a country in Africa, which is sort of semi-independent of his group per se, but follows many of his ideas. Now, this author goes into kind of the history of his thought and his books. So he's written several books, and he's referred to himself as Varilhorn or as Rael, which means God's light, according to him. And this is a name given to him, he claims, by the Elohim, the extraterrestrials, who have chosen him as like a messenger. And he says that he's visited their planet and visited their spaceship, and that he's being imparted with a lot of knowledge that's going to help liberate humanity. And so the author here is going through the books, going a little bit into Varilhorn's early history. So he was, had a fairly difficult upbringing. He had some difficulties in his early adulthood. He became a racing car driver, interestingly enough, but then that little venture collapsed because of the oil crisis in the Middle East. And apparently he was talking to a friend one day in a bar about UFOs, and he basically had an epiphany that he could just make up a UFO religion, and maybe that would get him out of his financial difficulties, and it did, very much so. So those early books in the 1970s, they really propelled him to fame. They appealed to many people in France who kind of already believed in UFOs and were trying to get away from like traditional Catholicism. Raelism really borrows heavily from Christian theology, but it sort of sprinkles its own themes onto it, like technology. So basically it's like technologizing spirituality, as a scholar has noted. The group set up chapters in different countries, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, Africa, the countries in Africa, Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere. And so a series of books where he talks about themes like world government, humanitarianism, sex, nanotechnology, robotics, cloning, the idea that the DNA is actually our soul, that there's no spiritual, non-material soul, that it's actually just the information in our DNA, and that if we clone ourselves, we can live forever. And even that we could download our consciousness onto a computer and then live inside a virtual world, or transfer our consciousness to another living body. So yeah, I don't want to go into all of the claims he makes in his books, but they basically along those lines. He also sets himself up as like the unquestionable leader that the aliens entrusted to bring this message to humanity, and that it offends them when you criticize him. So his followers are basically just doing whatever he says, and they see him as like a direct link to these aliens. He advocates for something called geniocracy, which is when very wise people, the smartest people, are in charge, very hierarchically organized. Although, many of the people who join the group are apparently not smart enough to know that he's, selling them complete lies. But that's a little bit unfair, because a lot of people who join cults are actually not stupid. They are successful professionals, like doctors, lawyers, etc. We see this in many cases, like the Solar Order, the Temple of the Solar Order, another cult. So they are smart people, but it's sort of like a yearning for meaning. The alienation of capitalism, etc., could cause people to want something like membership in these cults or sects. What else? So he also makes a lot of claims about sort of the theology within the Raelian movement and the sort of the cosmic scheme that he is imparting, like that he's talked to Jesus and Buddha, etc., and all this stuff, like when he went on the spaceship of the Raelian of the Elohim. Let's see. So yeah, the cloning debacle. I mean, that was a huge hot button topic in America, and I actually remember that. From back in the 90s or early 2000s, I should say. But that turned out to be a complete scam. There was a woman, if I find her name again, Beatrice, I think, but she was a chemist, but she never did any actual scientific work in the laboratory. It was purely photo ops. And there's a very good documentary series on Netflix that I recommend people watch. It shows like interviews with these different people, including Virilhon, and the chemist lady. She never did any work at all, like literally never did a single thing in the lab. There was a guy who was a sincere participant who wanted to do cloning because he felt like it was a positive contribution to science and society. He never got to do anything. And they obviously never produced any proof of cloning a human like they claimed that they did. Bridget Boycelia, that's her name, the chemist.
Did you ever go to their website back 20 years ago? Clonades?
Yeah.
Like they used to have, they said you could like pre-order clones of like Pierce Brosnan. I think they had Pamela Anderson and a couple other celebrities, and like they were priced differently. It was like $250,000 to like pre-order your future Pierce Brosnan clone whenever they could make it. Like it was a bit ridiculous back at the time.
Yeah. And pricing people differently. That's kind of contradicts their own claim that everybody is connected and equally worthy. If you just sort of believe the religion. So like it's very like he makes a lot of contradictions in his books, like things about the theology and the actual moral claims, and they often contradict each other. He's also kind of an unpleasant person, obviously kind of an authoritarian type. He set up this harem actually of women. He called them the angels, and they're like the most beautiful, outwardly beautiful women in the cult, and they're just meant to serve him. And he says that this is what the Elohim want. That's just a typical, ploy by cult leaders to turn people into sexual objects. Yeah, so I mean, when I read about this guy, it just makes me extremely angry, because even though you could make the argument that if somebody's dumb enough to be exploited, then maybe they deserve it, or it doesn't matter, but it's still very gross to exploit people based on lies. The other thing I mentioned,
I don't think that. I mean, I don't think it's just because someone is lacks insight or intelligence, it's not an excuse to exploit them. I mean, that actually just makes the exploitation worse from an ethical standpoint. Anyway, continue.
I was gonna say, back to the atheist creationism. So they actually reject evolution pretty much. They say that the gods are the aliens who created us about 20,000 years ago, that they created the earth about 25,000 years ago. They have got a flood story of their own. And obviously, of course, this goes against all of science. So, the aliens gave him, if they give him any knowledge about science, and it's just like science fiction science and complete fabrications as well. So the group has not made any scientific contributions to speak of whatsoever, which is itself something that contradicts his claim that they're trying to utilize science and technology. But it does raise the interesting point that was talked about by one of the sociologists who's quoted here, that it's one of the reasons for the group's success is that it technologizes spirituality. Technology is such a huge part of our everyday lives. People have become more skeptical about traditional spirituality, and so this kind of tries to reconcile them together. But there's actually other reasons for the success of the group, such as his charisma, the yearning that the followers have for meaning and purpose, and maybe they feel lost in modern society. So that's a pretty potent mix. And of course, it draws from traditional faith. So it's sort of a continuity of spirituality.
Well, he spent a week doing intensive Bible study before he invented the religion. He spent the week before he came up with his siding with Elohim, by studying the Bible. And it really is like the Raelian religion has been described as a biblical religion that's basically been bastardized and technologized, and repainted in that kind of framework. But if you break it down to it, like a lot of it goes, and that's why they use Judeo-Christian words like Elohim, Yahweh, etc., and whatnot, is because they basically cribbed it from the Bible. But I'll say I've said the same thing about UFOs. The UFOs, in a way, to many people, act as a religion of a sorts. It's just a religion for modernity where we have technology and whatnot. Instead of thinking about ghosts and fairies and supernatural stuff, we've kind of reframed it with what we understand: technology and visitors from space and whatnot. And that seems more plausible to us. We don't have to go as far out on a limb as believing in something totally supernatural to believe in, alien visitors or alien people, controlling or manipulating us. It's something that's, technically feasible in our minds that doesn't require that leap of belief in a supernatural entity.
Yeah, and also just because the UFO theme was prevalent by then. So the other thing here talks about pedophilia. So, I mean, they've disavowed pedophilia now, but he did, or the members have said some things which are very kind of questionable in the past about, children and sex. So they're the sort of
says, quote, "The child is for the adult a favored sexual object." Yeah, no.
I don't know how, somebody could read that any way other than an endorsement of pedophilia.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, to their credit, they did eventually disavow that stuff, but they should have never said it in the first place. That goes without saying. So, obviously his claims are not scientifically plausible, but it's still interesting to understand how it is that a group like that could become successful. And, you have to look at this from different vantage points to do with society, culture, the yearning for meaning and purpose, etc., and personal charisma and the relation between the leader and the follower. So what are they getting from this mutual relationship?
Yeah.
And interestingly, some of the scholars who kind of embedded themselves into the Raelian movement to study them, they themselves became kind of partial to the ideas in the group, and even became upset when, for example, they weren't invited to a meeting or something like that. So I found that sort of interesting.
Are we talking about someone else that like the scholar most famously associated with the Raelians, of course, is Susan Palmer, who's actually given a lecture on it at the UFO Congress I attended several years ago, and I have on DVD. But yeah, she wrote a book called Aliens Adored, and she wrote papers with Brian Sentes, which you guys had on Invisible Night School back in the day, on the Raelians. One of their papers on the Raelians you can find in that book, Alien Worlds, about the religious aspects of the UFO phenomenon, edited by Diana Tuminia, that I highly recommend going and reading. Also, the paper I posted in the chat about extraterrestrial exegesis, the Raelian movement as a biblical religion, because that paper actually kind of outlines how they basically reinvented, the Bible, but for modern times with technological terms. So it's very, very interesting stuff. But
and anything else? Did you want to say anything, Rachel?
Not really. I thought that I thought it was interesting. I think it's really interesting how Rael and other a lot of other cult leaders, not all cult leaders, but a lot of them, I think, are will decide to go on this kind of path because they've had some sort of failure in their life, like they're not succeeding at other things, and then they realize that they can do this potentially, or they have some sort of crisis in their life that causes them to go on a sort of religious path, more of a spiritual path. So maybe they realize that they are able to manipulate people, or they might have a spiritual experience and then they realize that they can exploit it. Like in this case, it seems that Rael went on the radio or something like that, and then realized after that maybe that oh well, people will actually listen to me if I do this kind of thing.
Yeah. It sort of reminds me of the Nazis. I don't want to equate the Raelians with Nazis, but if you think about who were the main leaders in the Nazi movement, like Himmler, these are extremely mediocre people, and it's almost like they were able to take their revenge in the world when they had power in the most horrific way. So that sort of does. There's a parallel here with like the dangers of unlimited power by people who have. Well, really anyone, actually. Nobody should have unlimited power, but some people should have it less than other people.
Yeah, if you haven't earned that, if you haven't gone through the process of earning your place in the social hierarchy, then it creates a very real danger because you don't understand the responsibility that you're being given.
Yep.
One thing that they said, there's also definitely an element of cults, of these small, new religious movements, of that they tend to be very sexually exploitative, and the leader will often use it as a way of fulfilling their sexual desires.
it seems to be a feature of every cult documentary I watch.
Not actually in the case of the Heaven's Gate movement. The leader actually wanted everybody, the males, to castrate themselves. So that was an exception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bo and Pete.
Yeah, that's all I had to say. So let's move on to the next chapter.
And this next chapter I found super interesting because you can apply this to so many different cases. I was thinking of the Lazar case actually, and its recent revival can be used. Like you can use this sort of model to understand it. So basically, this is talking about the Gulf Breeze UFO case back in the late 80s and early 90s, where there were many witnesses who saw things they couldn't explain. But like at the core of this wave or this flap, there was a few people who were, more prominent. And this author is talking about understanding that that saga, not so much as a UFO saga, but as a political recruitment phenomenon. And he talks about like out groups of skeptics and debunkers and in groups of believers and witnesses. How one of the players in this, Ed Walters, who was like one of the main UFO proponents, and he produced some fake UFO photos based on models that he built, but he promoted those as real, and many people believed him or pretended to believe him. That's the more interesting point, in order to push the UFO narrative. And that he was doing a kind of political recruitment, where he was trying to gain votes, here understood as belief in the UFO phenomenon as alien visitations. There he is on Oprah Winfrey's show in 1990, promoting the Gulf Breeze and defending himself against Phil Klass and other skeptics. So this the author here is Craig R. Myers, who is a journalist. He doesn't have like overall expertise in the UFO topic, but he does have expertise in this particular case. So he says, I am an expert on the reliability of one particular UFO witness's testimony and the impact that it had on the social environment of an entire Florida panhandle community in the late 80s to 90s. I believe that narrowing our focus on the Ed Walters case study yields numerous valuable insights into the wider topic at hand. So he talks about some very interesting things here from the world of psychology and politics. He talks about the certainty-uncertainty principle. So UFO contact claimants have a built-in contradiction that they can be completely confident that they saw something that they cannot identify. So wait, what's the point here? Yeah, so you're certain that you saw something that you're uncertain about.
Craig Myers was one of the main journalists. He wasn't just a journalist. He was one of the main journalists that reported on the case back at the time. So that's why he's so familiar with the people involved, because he was part of the story. He told the story.
Yeah, and he uncovered some stuff about Ed Walters faking the photos. Here he talks about Elizabeth Loftus and her work. So she's a psychologist who studied false memories, imagination inflation, and what those sorts of things, how they don't augur well for UFO eyewitness testimony, the reliability of it. So, for example, you can basically induce people to have false memories. In this case, in one study, she and her colleagues showed participants altered Disney World Remember the Magic ads describing a wonderful day in the theme park from a child's perspective. But there were some anachronistic elements in there, like Bugs Bunny shaking hands with Bugs Bunny after receiving the false Bugs ad. Ariel, who was a Disney character, but she hadn't been invented yet. And yet people started to sort of remember seeing these things when they were kids, even though they weren't there at the time, or they weren't part of the Disney, iconography at the time. So she says as well that surprisingly, the breakdown often occurs not in retention, but in the first stage of the witness process, acquisition. Even though an event is bright enough, loud enough, close enough, and even though attention is being paid, we can still find significant errors in a witness's recollection of the event. And they document other powerful influences, including stress and fear. But for Craig, he talks about something more relevant to the Gulf Breeze: expectations created by a peer group or interviewer, the misinformation effect in which a person's recollection can be significantly altered after exposure to misleading information, and most significantly, visual cues like photos and other images. Then he talks about political campaigns. So seeing the Gulf Breeze as a political campaign. So the candidate, obviously Ed Walters, is an ambitious community member, active promoter of his photos and the wider cultural phenomenon of UFO contact. The campaign is Walters and his supporters' international effort to obtain votes, defined as belief in the issue of UFO contact and a government debunker cover-up. Then the supporting party is MUFON, which is promoting his story. And they're basically trying to discredit the skeptics and other witnesses as well, who said that Ed Walters was fabricating his photos. And the opposition party, the informal network of debunkers and local skeptics, like the mayor and the police chief, the scandal, the styrofoam UFO model found in Walters' former house, and Tommy Smith's hoaxing testimony. Tommy Smith was a friend of Ed's, but he didn't want to go along with the hoax, and he exposed it. And then there was damage control done by Walters and MUFON. And the election, the 1990 MUFON convention, where support for Walters was confirmed, followed by Ed's effort to convert that into real votes in his run for city council. Although he lost, spectacularly, he came 9th out of 9th, and obviously he didn't win that contest. But this is a very interesting way of viewing a UFO saga, is sort of a political recruitment drive, where you've got these different parties vying for influence or so-called votes. There's often a scandal involved, something about the candidate is exposed, and then their credibility can take a hit. Ed Walters is still sort of seen by many people in ufology as credible, even though he was exposed as, doing a hoax. Sort of like in the way that maybe Richard Nixon or Bill Clinton, they're still seen as there's still people who support them, but that, people kind of acknowledge that, yes, they did do some bad things. Then it just goes into sort of the history of the Ed Walters and what he was trying to get out of this, the context at the time, which was like Whitley Strieber's Communion, Bud Hopkins' Intruders. So the UFO topic and abductions were, a thing in the media at the time. The X-Files was, shortly thereafter in 1993, and that series itself referenced the Gulf Breeze. Political context, this area of Florida was sort of a mix of conservative and liberal. There was a military presence as well, and nebulous New Age beliefs and more conservative Christian beliefs. But each side there got something from this story. So, there was kind of like the spiritual paranormal stuff that the New Age believers and more liberal types believe in, and then there's like the anti-government stuff that the more conservative people believe in, because conservative or GOP propaganda against the federal government was a theme at the time. Well, it still is.
Before we move on about the abductions, one of the interesting things about the whole abduction kind of aspect of this is that he would later, I think Class it was maybe accused him of saying he was an abductee. And he responded, I don't know if it was on Oprah or another show, but he said, I've never claimed to be an abductee. I never said I was abducted. None of this ever. Only if you actually go look in his book, he directly does state that himself, and contradicts his own narrative. But he got really mad on national television, I never claimed to be an abductee. You're putting words in my mouth. No, They didn't put words in his mouth. He does in fact say that in his book. So,
Yeah. That was a fairly common thing, actually, that he would say. He also said that you would have to be blind if you thought that the mock-up, the sort of reconstruction by Craig,
it's the same.
Is the same, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. And they did find the UFO in his house, in Ed's house. So obviously he did it. He faked it, and
but he says that was planted. Somebody
of course he would. Yeah, and that itself became part of the anti-government and cover-up narrative. So, so there was a lot of evidence that went against him. Obviously, he and also Bruce Maccabee was working with him and promoting the story. Maccabee would then say that the UFO, the model was obviously a model, but that somehow Ed was still credible. That was kind of weird. Even though Maccabee was supposedly one of the more level-headed and sober UFO proponents. In this case, he obviously gaffed. There's a photo there on page 125 showing the author's recreation of picture using the model that was found. and on the right is the original figure by Ed Walters. Okay, and but still, Ed he was deflecting this on Oprah with like really poor excuses, but people still went along with it because of they wanted to believe that their own experiences could be validated, and so there was a sort of tacit acceptance of lying. And he talks about this as well in this article, that social identity theory, which was developed by a British psychologist in the late 70s, talks about how groups can sort of form in-group cohesion and compare themselves positively to other groups, right? And that according to this theory, a group may pursue one of three strategies for advancement: social mobility, social competition, and social creativity, in which they reframe a negative attribute as positive or stress achievement in a different domain. And that's sort of what Ed Walters was doing. But there were elements of the other strategies as well in this whole thing. And he talks about Princess Caribou, who was a British woman who passed herself off as Asian royalty in 1817. And she was exposed after a few months. But basically, Ed Walters was doing something sort of similar, but he was relying on this sort of tacit agreement that people can have when they're backing a liar. So somebody could be lying and everybody else is going along with it. It's not so much that they're also lying, it's that they ignore or they accept a lie in order to defend a greater truth, or because the cost of uncovering the lie is too great. Maybe they've got other things to do. Maybe they believe in some aspect of the platform sold by the liar. So we see this in politics all the time when politicians, not just Trump, but other politicians, say something, and then people will go along with it even if they don't really believe it, because there's a cost to investigating that claim, and maybe for them it's just not worth it. So this is like a political calculation that politicians and their campaign managers do, is when to lie, what are the costs versus the risks of lying. And in this sort of climate where more people were coming out and saying that, yes, I'm a UFO experiencer or witness, they were starting to become the in-group now, whereas before they were shunned. Now they were becoming kind of the mainstream, and it was the skeptics who were seen as like the outsiders and the bad people. And so Ed Walters really leaned into that. And, again, especially on the Oprah Winfrey appearance, when he was questioned by Phil Klass and others on technical grounds, he would just sort of build this concentric circle of defense around himself. He would call upon the witnesses in the Gulf Breeze incident or the flap, saying like, how could so many people be wrong? You would have to say that they're also lying. But in fact, you don't need to say that. It's just they're backing a liar. That's the political campaigning principle that Craig is talking about here. Again, Bruce Maccabee was involved in a very kind of strange way. And some people in MUFON did eventually break away, and they said that they thought that Sorry, you guys continue.
I was also just going to mention, I don't know if you were planning to get into the Tommy Smith kind of aspect of the story, and this was a guy that kind of knew Ed Walters, and he's the one that kind of came out and said that he had helped Ed Walters fake these photos using this double kind of photo exposure process, and that using this kind of model. And another story kind of eventually came out where apparently Ed Walters actually had a history and was known to do this. It was a thing he would do for like kids' birthday parties for like his kids and family friends and stuff, where he would do trick photography with double exposure shots, like I guess where he'd like make people look like there's a ghost behind them or something at like birthday parties. So he had a history and a habit of doing trick photography with double exposures before the Gulf Breeze incident. And then this Tommy Smith kid came out, saying that, yeah, I helped them fake some of these photos using this double exposure technique that he, was well known to do at parties and stuff. But yet again, like Louise said, some people said that, well, this model doesn't match exactly. It doesn't look identical to the photos he's taken. But yeah, I'd also recommend, there's a YouTuber who made a video a year or two ago. They went and investigated the Gulf Breeze, and they kind of figured out where the house was, and they recreated the photos, and their photos look pretty good, pretty similar to the ones created in this document here. But again, they're not exact, but I mean, they're not gonna be exact. You don't have that exact model that he had. You don't have the exact conditions that you knew that he took it in. But I think they're close enough. And the fact that the guy had a history of this, that puts some serious doubt as to whether these photos were really taken, how he claims they were taken.
Yeah. And there was also the councilwoman Pollack's photo showing like a zigzag.
Oh, yeah.
That didn't really show anything that was congruent with Ed Walter's claims, but still, that became part of the that whole milieu. But there's also on page 134, according to Craig, he got from a source that he trusts, a witness who saw Ed building a UFO in his garage, and people were like, and with Smith as well, who was Ed's friend, who didn't go along with the hoax. People were dogpiling them, including MUFON. They were dogpiling these witnesses, even though you're supposed to trust witnesses. So that's a sort of interesting thing. There was also like discussion about the, when women are not believed in sexual assault or harassment cases, like when Bill Clinton was, under investigation. Many of the people who would otherwise say women should be believed, they were trying to, discredit the women. This is sort of similar in that sense, because witnesses who saw dodgy things going on, suddenly like their backgrounds were being, they were trying to find dirt on them. And in other words, like the same tactics that the UFO believers claimed that the government, and Ed Walters himself claiming that, the government is trying to discredit him by looking at his background and criminal convictions and stuff like that. So that's interesting.
It's also interesting that his editor at the Pensacola News Journal was Ken Fortenberry, who wrote a book on his father's very famous UFO sighting, the Fortenberry-Nash sighting, one of the most famous UFO sightings in all of ufology. Happened to be this guy, his son was this guy's editor at the Pensacola Times.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, everyone's connected.
Yeah, I'll say I found that the social identity theory stuff interesting. It goes along with a lot of this stuff that I've been talking about for a couple of years on Twitter now, about various in-group, out-group biases and rationalization marketplaces, and how the UFO community kind of, how these apply to the UFO community. And they address some of the exact same things here. How a lot of the times, I really like that term, rational ignorance, that they mention. And I've talked about this on this show, how sometimes it's advantageous to choose something that's actually irrational. Like there's more of an advantageous benefit to us to embrace something that's actually irrational, or to be ignorant of, its ration, than it is to actually accept it. And like they said, they use that example of like that washing machine. Sometimes it's better. It's more rational to be ignorant of knowing how to do everything, and because you can pay somebody to do that, than to spend your time trying to figure out and learn how to do everything. And but in another, not just that, I think there's also sometimes, like I said, where it's just outright beneficial to choose a more irrational kind of option. Like if you live in a community that's highly religious, where like maybe you might be stoned if you don't believe in that religion, it's going to be better for you to go along for the sake of group and societal cohesion and kind of pretend like you're part of the group and believe on all that than to, express true feelings that you don't believe it, you're not part of it, because that might not be good for you overall. And I see this, like you say, in political situations a lot, where there's a lot of people I talk to, whether they support Trump, Biden, or whoever they support, like where they actually, like you talk to them, they don't actually believe half the stuff the person they support says. Like, yeah, I don't actually believe a lot of that stuff. But they go along with it because for a variety of reasons. Maybe they like one thing the person says and they think the other things are not that big of a deal that they can just ignore it because they support one of the things the person supports. I mean, there's lots of reasons why we choose to be ignorant about stuff that isn't even necessarily the most irrational choice to make. Sometimes it is the rational choice to make.
Yep. And I like to apply this model to the Elizondo claims, because he's sort of starting to lean into this, build a kind of concentric circles of defense around himself. When he's challenged, he'll say, well, what about, all the people in the world who have seen UFOs, or all the witnesses? He's like supporting Grush. He's supporting all these so-called whistleblowers, and he's like, his claims are constantly being exposed. So that's like the scandal aspect. But then do the believers really care?
Not really, apparently.
Yeah, many of them don't anyway.
Well, and that was one of the arguments they made about the Gulf Breeze case, kind of, is how they talk about, like, okay, so this is fake, but what about the hundreds of other peoples that saw things in the Gulf Breeze area, over the years or what? It's like, okay, but I mean, you can only really look at each case on a case-by-case basis on its own merits. And we don't know what's the exact number of how many people actually saw something. How many people saw something on the news and then just thought back in their memory, I saw something that kind of looked weird. And so you then call that a sighting. You get that report release phenomenon that once something's publicized in the news, then you get all sorts of other people that go mine their memory for anything even vaguely unusual and report those as sightings. Like, how many of those 100 other sightings were just stars, planes, balloons, Chinese lanterns, and other things? Like, you have to look at each individual one. The fact that people in Gulf Breeze, other people saw stuff, does not change the fact that El Walter's case was probably him hoaxing photos. We have to look at each case individually. And unfortunately, a lot of people use this whole, like, the volume argument, like, as kind of evidence. So, like, well, there's just so many people, like there's gotta be something here because we've got so many people saying this. It's like, yeah, but a lot of times when you go back down to it, it's not a whole bunch of people saying it. It all started off with one or two people, and then it just kind of grew from there, and got added on to. Like, it's not like 100 people simultaneously reported a sighting individually. Like, no, it's like one or two people did, and even when you have people with you, like mass sightings where the whole group of people are together, like a lot of the times it's one person that thinks they see something, they point it out, and through these kind of group dynamics, people are like, yeah, that does look kind of weird. Yeah, what is that? What's going on? And you get a whole group of people that think they see something weird. But those group dynamics they talk about and how people kind of want to conform when they're in groups, plays a big role in events like this. And so we can't necessarily take these, like the number of people that also claim they saw something, as supporting any other kind of case.
Tim Brigham in the chat is saying that there were a lot of sightings at Gulf Breeze, but one of the reasons may also have been because of military experimentation. I remember years ago when I was researching Gulf Breeze that I saw some of this, that they would have sky watching parties, or sky watching groups at Gulf Breeze, and there was videos that people took of stuff flying around over the ocean that was probably, I'm guessing, military drones or something like that.
Because that's the thing, like right off the coast is like a big, like a military operations area where they do training, and then there's like the Pensacola, like air, station or base, and like the whole area is heavily, full of military like bases on operations. So, there's a lot of things that I think they could be military that they're just picking up. In fact, I think some of the later Gulf breeze photos or videos like were proven to be like military operations, like flares or things being done.
Yeah, I remember there. I'm gonna have to go back and find it because there was one of like there was like a light and it was dropping, like it was dripping or something. Like there's something coming off of it.
Yeah,
it's really cool, but also probably totally fake.
I mean, talking about people using pyrotechnics to fake UFO sightings, this is that time Stephen Greer hired a plane to drop flares during one of his CE5 events off the East Coast to pretend that people saw UFOs. And then the pilot admitted, or I guess they signed an NDA, or they couldn't admit it, but they tracked down the plane. So yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, it looks like Tim knows what I'm talking about. Yes, doggy.
Yeah.
Can we have dogs host the show sometime? Just have Luis dogs host the show. Sort of like dogs playing poker, or dogs talking about UFOs. Yeah, you know, looking at, I really want to watch this Oprah Winfrey special about, you know, with Walters, because you know, reading that account, it reminds me of so many social situations, you know, that you encounter around UFOs. This is not like some sort of exception to the rule. Like, think of that, you know, for example, that early Air Force press conference where, you know, someone asks a question from the audience and, you know, everyone just bursts out laughing. You know, there's a lot of like, you know, swaying the crowd, not through so much through argument, but through, you know, through group identification and you know, yeah, that kind of thing. I think that the campaign is a really great analogy, because it seems like Walters was very much manipulating public opinion, and deliberately doing so in really dishonest ways, just the same way that a politician would.
Oh, we didn't mention, I don't think, he actually he went from being like an analogy of being a candidate to actually being a political candidate. He ran for city council, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately he lost. Like there was like 9 people running, and the way it worked was that the 4 people with the most votes got council positions, and apparently he got in last place, number 9. He only got like 300 something votes out of the 9,000 something people that voted. So despite being the MUFON candidate, as this article refers to him several times, and his UFO claims, it did not appear to help him politically to get votes when it came down to actually running for office. Because I say a lot of people, they talk about how politicians kind of will sell bunk to people that are willfully ignorant, but they won't try it with people that are more well-informed, or try to be more well-informed and read on like a topic matter. And apparently his UFO claims didn't make people believe he would be any better councilman, you know, than, you know, he did say my UFO stuff has nothing to do with my ability to be a councilman in this political position. But either way, he didn't get his, he didn't win, and he didn't end up on city council. And I don't know, is he still around? Is he alive or dead? Does anybody know?
I do not know. Do you know, Tim?
Yeah, like I wonder what he, I mean, he could still be alive age-wise. Oh, in hiding, huh? So yeah, in hiding. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know whatever happened to that guy. He's just not around anymore. But I do have a post on, I think I have a couple of posts based on the various photo events that people can search for Gulf Breeze on my Twitter and find. So has anybody seen that Oprah video Luis, have you seen the video? Do you know if it's online anywhere? No?
No.
Yeah, that'd
No.
be interesting to track down. I'd like to see that.
Me too. Definitely.
Oh, yeah, I guess there was some controversy. I believe, if I remember correctly, there was some controversy with the book deal and like Bruce Maccabee's cut between him and Ed Walters. I don't remember the details about it, though, but I think there was an issue with like between them on the payment on their cut of the deal or whatever. But yeah, he made quite a bit of money on it. So, yeah.
Okay. Is that everything, Luis?
Yep.
Okay.
So,
all right. I'm going to move on to the grand finale. Hold on, I'm getting some anomalous, weird buzzing sound. What is that?
do you happen to be on the Boeing Starliner right now? Are you getting a weird pulsing sound and mission controls telling you they don't know what's going on?
I'm thinking it's auroral sounds. That's what I'm going with.
I think it's just a classic CE2 case. Even though there's no flying saucer. Let's just lump it in anyway.
Well, as you know, many of the CE2 cases I've covered didn't actually involve any alleged flying saucers, just effects left by maybe a saucer.
A maybe CE2. Schrodinger CE2.
Yes.
Okay. And for our final story, this weekend was the 19th annual Kites Over Lake Michigan Festival. A wide variety of kites were flown over Two Rivers, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan this weekend, including various types of novelty kites. Here is an image of a flying pig kite, flown in honor of Lou Elizondo to officially mark the arrival of UAP disclosure. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not necessarily those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or the other hosts. Please visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com. Why? Because ufology is corrupt.com. Also, read Jack Brewer, read Mark Pilkington, and please, for the love of God, boycott UAP advocacy content. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on the history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he doesn't make hardly any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Timothy Brigham, Swink McLeod, Amy Collins, Raka, OG Skywatch, and I'm sorry if I forgot anyone.
The Poltergeist.
Simon Fly, thank you for joining again. Thank you to Jiddu Krishnamurti. Thank you, everybody in the whole world ever.
Ufos is a real person. I've been trying to incarnate as a Tombaugh. Apparently, my magic rituals are not working well enough because Rachel here is saying it's not a real person. But I'm working on it.
Well, you know what? We can have a Ufos egregore. I don't mind doing that. That sounds cool.
Sounds good.
And yeah, in the words, what's that?
That should do it.
Okay. In the words of the disc, everything happens for a saucer.